the Lord builds the house, those who build and labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early to go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved in sleep. Lo, sons are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons of one's youth. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat at a table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was sitting at the table of the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair from her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, "You thought it. If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner." And Jesus, notice that, he thought it, now Jesus isn't answering him. Answering, said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he answered, "What is it, teacher?" A certain creditor had 2 debtors. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he forgave them both. Now, which of them would love him more? Simon answered, "The one, I suppose, to whom he forgave more." And he said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with my ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she has loved much, but he who has forgiven little loves little." And he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Now the speaker over there. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be accepting and pleasing in your sight this day. Amen. So before we get started today, can I have all those who served as veterans just raise your hand so that we can see? Thank you all for your service. I know though many of you that I've spoken to have served in many different capacities, and so we give thanks for your willingness to serve us. And so let's just take a moment of silence in remembrance of those who aren't with us today or may not have made it home as well. Amen. On this day, we remember the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. After the First World War ended and came to a close. And as we honor and we thank our military veterans around the world for their service, both present and past, we also remember those who suffered those great physical and emotional and psychological problems. Today is Veterans Day. And does anyone know the roots or purpose of this holiday? World War I. Well, yes, that is what's called Armistice Day. Veterans Day came after World War II. So they were actually, originally we celebrated what's called Armistice Day, which is what they still celebrate in Europe and London and France. And that's why the president was over there this past, or this weekend. I don't know if he came back yet or not, but that's why he was over there. And so, yes, it's to honor that 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, when the cessation of hostilities of World War I took effect. It wasn't until a number of years later that we would come to know this day as Veterans Day. It was supposed to be the end of the war that would end all wars. That's what World War I was called, the war to end all wars. In 1926, Congress passed a resolution to commemorate the day with thanksgiving and prayer and exercises designed to perpetuate peace through goodwill and mutual understanding. That's what they said in 1926. And then in 1938, the day became known as Armistice Day. So originally it wasn't even called Armistice Day. It was just kind of the day that we all knew that we were going to commemorate to those who had lost their lives and to advocate for peace and mutual understanding and goodwill. The intent of the day was to be dedicated to world peace. In 1954, after World War II, when the world stood in the horror at the sight of what the Nazi genocide machine had done and the bombings of civilians through the deployment of nuclear weapons, the day became known as Veterans Day, which is what we know today. A day to honor those who served in our military. So it kind of took a little bit of a shift in 1954. I say that if we truly want to honor our veterans, one of the best ways that we can do it is to keep them out of harm's way in the first place, to keep them safe, so that way their families or they don't have to struggle with what happens in war. I say that we can remember and honor what Armistice Day was, what this holiday originally had been intended to be, which was to be an end to violent conflict between nations around the world. In this passage from Luke, we find an interesting lesson that Jesus offers to a Pharisee. Now, it's a lesson or a parable that we have probably heard from time to time. You see this a similar story in the other three Gospels, but this one's a little bit different because of not only where it takes place, but who the people in there are. So in the other three Gospels, or rather in Matthew and Mark, you see a similar story with a guy named Simon, but he's not a Pharisee, he's a leper. Oh, hey Ed. Ed's with us, so it's good to see you, Ed. So they had this story with Simon the leper and then this woman that came in to see them. In Luke, it's earlier in the storyline, and it's with this Pharisee. This may be a parable that you have heard in a few sermons, and I've become especially fond of this parable because I believe that it is the most core and essential parable to Jesus' ministry. And it truly speaks to, and clearly to, the character and the intention of Jesus' ministry that he passed on to us. I believe that it is most fitting for this day that we call Veterans Day or Armistice Day. So let's dive in and see what Christ has to offer us for today. The forgiveness that Jesus offers to this woman is extremely radical for this occasion. This woman has come into this gathering of some of the most prominent people in her town, and they are there to speak with this young prophet who was the talk of the town, really the talk of the whole countryside at that time. This young woman walks in and she kind of disrupts and interrupts this entire gathering to do some really radical things. First of all, in the ancient world, women were supposed to kind of keep their place. They were meant to stay out of the way and not really interact with the men. They weren't supposed to talk to them too much. They certainly, as I said to the kids, were never supposed to let down their hair. And to touch his feet would have been kind of a real weird thing of the day because, as we know, they didn't have the clean streets that we have today. So everybody knew that it was dirty to touch someone's feet, let alone kiss someone's feet. She begins to push this envelope and begins taking up more and more of their time with all these actions that she does for Christ. And at this point, it's almost assured that the people of this gathering are going to say something or at least think something. And the question revolves around what they will say. Jesus apparently has no doubt about what has prompted her display of extravagant hospitality and extreme devotion. To share his knowledge with others, he asks Simon a brief question that takes the form of this short parable. Who do we think would be more grateful? Jesus asks. A man whose debt is 500 denarii, or the man who has 50 if they're both canceled. A denarii was the value of a day's wage. So for the one guy, it would have been 500 days of wage, and for the other guy, it was 50. It's a big range. But for the point of this short parable, that's almost besides the point. All that's required here is a basic understanding of faith. As the first man is forgiven 10 times the debt that the other is. Simon knows how to count, and so answers that he supposes would probably be the one that had the much higher amount canceled. The obvious analogy here is to the woman who has been bathing Christ's feet with her tears. She has been forgiven much, perhaps 10 times than all the other people sitting in that room. Which explains why she is devoting herself to Jesus, weeping at his feet. She is overcome with gratitude, the kind of gratitude understood only by some who have been given everything. But is forgiveness really everything? Can it possibly be worth that much? Consider this. Forgiveness at our heart, is the restoration of relationship. So when we came to the end of World War I, and we decided to form this day as nations around the world, called Armistice Day, that was our forgiveness. That was our reconciliation. That day would eventually lead to the formation of things like the UN and different peace accords throughout history. Not only to try and keep us safe, but to maintain those relationships and to keep us close together. Forgiveness gives back to ourselves as well. You see, after a while, being indebted, owing others, knowing yourself first and foremost as a sinner, these realities can dominate and define you. You are no more and no less than what you've done, the mistakes you've made, the debt you owe. When you are forgiven, all those limitations disappear. You are restored, renewed, and set free. So yes, forgiveness really, truly is everything. There are many reasons why people follow religious practices. For some of us, we follow religious practices because it brings us hope in uncertain times. For some, we do it simply because it's what our family's always done. For others, we do it because we're worried about our eternal resting place, i.e., we're worried about whether or not we're going to go to heaven or hell. For some, we are desperately want to know Jesus, and for some, we see it as a means to simply be a better person. In the end, there's importance to each of these aspects, but the problem that we have in this world is that none of them give us a complete faith that will stand the test of time and make us stronger in the end. They all have holes, they all are lacking. In our passage, we see two people who are practicing religion, their religion, for different reasons. The Reverend Alan Bream says this, that Jesus attends a dinner at the home of a Pharisee named Simon. He must have been a person of some prominence because he's one of the few Jewish leaders to be called by name in the Gospels. So he must have been really, really powerful. Apparently, Simon had heard about Jesus, and he was curious to see for himself what this rabbi from Nazareth was all about. There's no indication that Simon had a genuine interest in becoming a disciple of Jesus. He was just curious about him. The fact that Jesus wasn't the only guest suggests that Simon must have invited some of his friends to the dinner, presumably other big Jewish leaders of the day. And it's hard to tell what his motivation was on the surface of things. Was he simply curious? Did he want to question Jesus? Was he out to demonstrate that his piety was superior to this carpenter from Galilee? It's hard to say. The contrast in the story is this woman who comes to Jesus. Luke's gospel simply says that she is, or was, a sinner. Although some translations assume that she lived an immoral life, we don't really know that. We don't know much about her. Yes, Jesus said that her sins were many, but that's the statement that could apply to all of us, each and every one of us. In Jesus' day, people like Simon had all kinds of reasons for calling someone a sinner, most of which had nothing to do with the person's actual character. It was more just the cultural things of the day. But she knows that she's a sinner. And she knows something else as well. Her sins have been forgiven. It's hard to know what motivated her to break all those social norms and crash this dinner party with its VIP guests. Apparently, she has had some kind of encounter with the love of God that Jesus embodied for us in this world. For her to come and touch his feet would have rocked their world. As if that weren't surprising enough, she also dries them with her hair. These were things that a woman simply didn't do to a man who was not her husband, nor would they have done it in public, even if it was for her husband. This woman who came and did all these things for Jesus was a woman who had a bit of a reputation in Simon's town. She is ultimately looked down upon and is considered less than for the people in this time. And yet, Jesus takes her into his loving arms, so to speak, and embraces her and reconciles her to himself because of her faith. Jesus is the guy that we are supposed to be following, and he breaks once again with so many of the cultural norms of his day. This is why we can say that he is a radical. He did not conform. This is an extremely important lesson for us to consider, especially today as we celebrate 100 years since the end of the war to end all wars. World War I was supposed to be this final act before humanity could move towards more peaceful times for everyone. And as we know, as we sit here 100 years later, this did not come true. There are many reasons for this, some of which are our country's fault, some of which are the faults of other countries. No part of humanity is completely free of the guilt of violence and war, and it's an imperative on us to consider the life of Jesus in all of our world perspectives. So as we celebrate today, I think we should celebrate those who have served. We should honor them because it's a big sacrifice to leave your family, to leave your country, to go to a place you've never been. I know just going on trips to places I've never been to is terrifying. But to know you're going to be there for years must be extremely scary. So we should honor those people who have given up years of their life for our country, for ourselves. But let's not forget what this day was supposed to be from the beginning. Let's hold both those things in balance. We don't want to honor our veterans so much that we forget the peace that we were supposed to uphold. We don't want to do it the other way, being too naive to think that war may not ever come again. We live in a broken world, and it's imperative on us to fight for the peace, even if we recognize that may not always be there. And then when it's not there, we have to wrestle with what do we do next. But friends, let's remember those who have lost their lives, especially those men that lost their lives in those trenches 100 years ago. And let's work really, really hard as a people of faith to support those things that keep our men and women out of those positions, that keep them safe. Jesus does not like war, as no person truly likes war. And we should fight to keep them safe and to keep our world filled with peace. Amen.